Slow, stinky, and crazy funky. That's how I would describe this 1982 Pontiac 6000LE diesel. Now, most of you have heard of the Pontiac 6000. It was a variant of General Motors A-body vehicles that came out in 1982. And the A-body vehicles included the Chevrolet Celebrity, the Pontiac 6000, the Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra, and the Buick Century. The A-bodies were effectively just a little bit bigger X cars, and the X cars were the vehicles that General Motors introduced for the 1980 model year that introduced the American public to GM's front-wheel drive, transversely mounted engine and transmission vehicles. And those would be the Chevrolet Citation, Pontiac Phoenix, Olds Omega, and Buick Skylark. The A-bodies had the same wheelbase and width as the X cars, but were a little bit longer overall, and they had worked out a number of the teething problems that the X cars had, including the braking issues. The 6000 was the sporty variant of the A cars, or at least a sportier variant. This was the luxury edition, though, hence the 6000LE trim on this particular vehicle, or as some people like to refer to it, the Ghoulie, because they thought the 6 was really a G. An interesting tidbit of information is that this was during a time frame when Pontiac was thinking of switching over to numeric badging for its vehicles, similar to Audi. And you had the Pontiac J2000, later the Sunbird that came out in 1982. You had the 6000, as I mentioned, and that was really it. But there were plans for other numerical vehicles, like the 8000 being the Bonneville, I believe. But that just never came to fruition. At some point, somebody determined that the numeric scheme just wasn't in keeping with the Pontiac tradition. But let's now transition to taking a look at this handsome burgundy painted 6000LE diesel. And first thing you note up front is that it's got that characteristic Pontiac split grille, although it's pretty muted here. But that was a trait that Pontiac introduced for the 1959 model year. And aside from the 1960 Pontiac, every Pontiac ever since that point, and maybe the Fiero, had a split grille. And of course, here this is true to that theme as well. I do enjoy that the designers blacked out the door frames and the B-pillar trim, as opposed to the X cars that had those chromed. And I think that the intent there was to give this car a more airy feel, at least a more airy upper. And you also have a so-called six-window design. You have a rear quarter glass there that's the fixed pane of glass behind the rear door. That was something that the X cars did not have. Those X cars had a bit chunkier C-pillar. So the car was meant to look a little bit more light and airy than the X vehicles. Lastly, you also have a very characteristic for the time GM belt line, which is a belt line that's below the cowl height. So notice how high the cowl is there with the wipers, and then you'll see the belt line is below that. That was very typical of GM styling during this time frame, and not quite sure. I think that the main reason, again, was just to give the car an overall glassy feel. Notice as we rotate around to the side of the car, you can see a little bit better what I was talking about in terms of that glassy daylight opening with the six-window design, that fixed rear quarter glass, and the stainless trim that outlines the daylight opening, kind of drawing your eye to the full width of the opening as opposed to various sections of it, like was true on the X car. This car, aside from the optional faux wire wheel covers, also has the locking gas cap, which you can see there. That's a relatively rare option on these 80s era GM vehicles. Well, I guess fuel was expensive during this time frame. You didn't want somebody siphoning gas out of your, I think these cars had maybe a 14 or 15 gallon tank, if I recall correctly, something like that. But in any case, you wanted to keep your fuel to yourself, so had to get that locking gas cap. This car also has mud flaps. I can't quite tell if they are dealer installed on here, Pontiac or aftermarket. A relatively popular option for the time to help protect your vehicle. Lastly, take a look at the rear window on this car. These vehicles did have flush glass front and rear. Some of the earlier GM cars to have that. The side glass wasn't really flush, given how it was configured with the framed doors. But front and rear glass on these was flush, and again, that was done for wind noise as well as just overall clean looks. Let's now continue to rotate around to the rear of the car where you can see this is an earlier 6000. It doesn't have the full width tail lamps. Those will be introduced a bit later. And it has the clear diesel badging in very large letters here, the 6000LE diesel. You can't miss it. And of course, one would know that it's a diesel just by the plume of smoke that's coming out the back on one of these vehicles. Now, moving to the interior of this fun car, you can see that in this particular model year, the 6000LE seats were really meant to be luxurious. You have this so-called loose cushion design that GM had really pioneered back with the 1972 Oldsmobile 98 Regency. Kind of looks like there's these loose pillows that are just sitting there on the seat, but of course, they are attached. Notice that that loose cushion design only is incorporated into the seat back. Notice that the bottom of the seat doesn't have that similar loose cushion look. And I think that was done in part for durability because you're obviously sliding across the seat to get in and out, as well as cost, I would say. Some other auto companies like Chrysler tended to have that box cushion or loose cushion look on the top and the bottom, although in some cases they did cost it out. Like the 81 Imperial has that box cushion on the upper and lower portions of the seat. The 82 and 83 Imperial do not. That was a cost-saving move. Turning now to the dash, you can get a closer look of that here. Again, this is an early 6000 because of this two-spoke style steering wheel that would go away in later years, generally in favor of a four-spoke design that was more frequently employed. But I do love the funkiness of the 6000's dash. This was before the 6000 STE had come along with the super electronic dash, as well as the four-spoke wheel with all the steering wheel controls. But it still has kind of that 80s chic design, if you will. You'll notice that this car does have a GM electronic tuned radio, or electronic tuning radio, I should say, as opposed to the one where you've got to rotate the tuning knob to try to find the station. This one you can tune it in electronically. It also does have a rear window defogger. There's an on-off switch that is above the HVAC controls. That switch was actually also employed on other Pontiacs like the Firebird. Notice also that this car has manual windows, and one of the things that drove people crazy about some of the GM vehicles of this era, including the X cars, was that the window handles, when you were trying to roll the window down, you rolled the window crank clockwise as opposed to counterclockwise like you would do on most vehicles to lower the window. I don't know why GM did it in the opposite direction. It was something that was true for a number of their vehicles of this era, and it's admittedly a bit annoying because you get in a car and you're just so used to cranking clockwise to lower the window as opposed to the inverse. And, well, you end up just not going very far, very fast with the window travel. As we take a look at the rear seat, these A cars had decent space in the rear. I will say that the bottom cushion there is a bit short, and that does give you a little bit more of an appearance of legroom, but if you're a taller person sitting in the back seat here, you're sitting rather upright and you don't have all that much thigh support. But that's the way these vehicles are. The seats are pretty comfortable, though, at least the front seats. You notice you have these big headrests, and you also have the characteristic Pontiac door panel with the door pull that was employed on really all Pontiac interiors during this time frame, from Firebird to 6000 to Fiero. For whatever reason, Pontiac interior designers thought that that was a key design theme that they wanted to keep across the lineup and made it consistent. Now, before we press on to the under hood department, take a look at this brochure for the 1982 Pontiac 6000. You can see up at the top left the interior that we were just showing in this brochure. Of course, the interior in the brochure has a center console versus the car that we were showing does not have that console. But look at the interior in the middle of the page and the Viscount bucket seats. These were the same seats that were offered in the Firebird at the same time, and these are the seats that also were employed in the Firebird that was driving around on Knight Rider. So you didn't have to get a Firebird to get the Viscount bucket seats. You could get them in your Pontiac 6000. Of course, here they just call it the available reclining bucket seat. In the Firebird, it was the optional Viscount interior. And here we have arrived at the heart of the beast, the Oldsmobile-sourced 4.3-liter V6 diesel that's under hood in this Pontiac 6000. Now, this V6 diesel was introduced for the 1982 model year, and it would end its run in 1985, as would all General Motors passenger car Oldsmobile-sourced diesels, whether that was the 350 diesel, the V8 diesel, or this 4.3-liter V6 diesel. They all stopped after the 1985 model year. But you can see it's a pretty tight fit in here. This is a 90-degree V6, not a 60-degree V6, like the typical 2.8-liter engine, for instance, that would be under hood. Of course, some A cars in later years after the 6000 would get Buick's 3.8-liter V6, which was also a 90-degree design. This Olds 4.3-liter V6 diesel was a 90-degree design because it was based off of the Oldsmobile V8, and it was really just that V8 with two cylinders lopped off. Now, I will say an interesting part about this is that Oldsmobile didn't have a gas 90-degree V6. The diesel 90-degree V6 was its only 90-degree V6 that Oldsmobile ever produced. And it did have a number of the teething problems from the 350 diesel, which was introduced in 1978, sorted out by this point. More specifically, there were better head bolts on this. There was also better gasketing and sealing. And in general, the overall reliability of the engine was improved. The only problem, though, is that these engines did still suffer from some issues, most commonly intake manifold gaskets for whatever reason. And by this point, they're getting quite hard to service. The parts just really aren't available. There also were some injection pump issues similar to what was occurring on some of the V8s as they aged. You will notice that in this engine bay, there is the pancake-style Delco air conditioning compressor. It wasn't really that great of a compressor. The seals tended to leak after not that long of a time period and wasn't as durable as the previous A6 compressors, but it did use a little bit less horsepower, and I guess that's good because this V6 diesel only has 85 horsepower to give. That's about 5 horsepower less than the base 2.5-liter gas 4-cylinder engine. So this, unfortunately, is not a quick car. There's about 165 pound-feet of torque, which also isn't really all that great either. But one thing about this diesel that was really great was its fuel economy. I can say from knowing people that own these that if you had one of these diesels and you kept the speed to about 65, 70 miles an hour on the freeway, you could get close to 40 miles per gallon with them. They really were quite fuel efficient, especially for the time, and given the relatively large size, 4.3 liters is not a small diesel. But that was the whole intent of these engines, was to help General Motors meet its corporate average fuel economy standards, and that was why they were introduced in 1978 and had proliferated by this point into a couple other forms, most notably the V6 form found here. But they were still stinky, they were still a bit noisy and crude. This is not the diesels of today. Under hood. Diesels back in the early 80s were a bit crude, and you can imagine it was a 90-degree V6 diesel, so it was odd firing, and it just didn't quite have the smoothness that I think buyers expected, especially because these A cars weren't cheap. If you're driving a Pontiac 6000LE during this time frame, wouldn't be surprising for the car to be about $15,000 back then, or getting into the high $30,000 today. That's quite a bit of coin for something that's really not all that refined. And as a result, as I mentioned, after the 1985 model year, all of the Oldsmobile-sourced diesels were canned. Interestingly, they were only around for 1 year in the C-body cars, the Buick Electra, the Olds 98, the Cadillac Fleetwood, and then they would be axed after that. Hope you enjoyed this brief special on this stinky 1982 Pontiac 6000LE diesel. Thanks again for watching.